The night was quiet except for the whispering wind moving through the dry grass outside the Apache camp. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and earth, and the flicker of firelight danced across the tent walls, painting moving shadows that looked almost alive. Inside, the Apache chief knelt beside the woman lying on a blanket of fur, his dark hair falling over his shoulders, his eyes deep and unreadable. She was trembling, her breath uneven, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. He reached out, his hands steady, his voice low and warm, carrying both command and care as he said, "I need to make love. Don't move, or it will hurt more." His tone was not one of force, but of something deeper, something that held the weight of fate itself. Outside, the night was alive with the distant calls of coyotes and the soft rustle of leaves. The campfire burned low, glowing like an ember against the black of the desert. The woman's mind was torn between fear and trust. She had been brought here by circumstances beyond her control, captured when the soldiers she traveled with were ambushed on the southern trail. Yet, since that night, the Apache chief had not treated her as a prisoner. He had given her food, tended her wounds, and spoken to her not as a conqueror, but as if he understood her pain. Now, under the quiet hum of the firelight, she found herself caught between danger and a strange kind of safety. His name was known across the territories. Some called him the Wolf of the Red Mesa. Others spoke of him as a spirit of vengeance. But beneath the stories there was a man whose tribe had suffered loss after loss. He had seen his people hunted, his home burned, and his heart hardened by betrayal. The woman before him reminded him of a past he had buried, a past where tenderness had once meant weakness. Yet now, as he looked into her frightened eyes, something inside him shifted. The war that had filled his life with rage seemed to fade for just that moment, replaced by something raw and human. The woman, her hands clutching the fur beneath her, could feel his presence like the warmth of the fire itself. Her breath caught as she remembered the journey that led her here. She had left the border town hoping for peace, carrying nothing but hope and a secret that she had not spoken aloud. Her husband had fallen months ago in battle, and she had been left to fend for herself. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The attack on the trail had taken everything from her again, except her life. And now, in this strange shelter among people she had been taught to fear, she was face to face with the man who held her destiny. He leaned closer, his face shadowed by the firelight. She could see the scars that ran across his shoulder and chest marks of war, of survival. His hand moved to her stomach, gentle, cautious, as if asking permission. "You are hurt inside," he said softly, his English rough but clear. "If I do not help, the pain will not leave you." She didn't understand his words at first, not fully, but his eyes told her what his mouth could not. There was no cruelty in his gaze, only concern. Still her heart raced with confusion, fear, and something she could not name. The walls of the tent seemed to close in, the fire crackled louder, and time slowed to the rhythm of their breathing. Outside, the camp was still. Warriors sat by the dying fires, watching the stars that stretched endlessly across the night sky. Somewhere, an elder hummed a low tune that carried through the air like a forgotten prayer. Life in the Apache world was hard and uncertain, ruled by honor and survival. Yet even in such a world, moments like this, moments of fragile humanity, found their way through the cracks. The chief had learned that sometimes strength was not found in battle, but in the quiet choice to protect rather than destroy. The woman's mind drifted to her past, the sound of church bells in the old town, the way her husband's hands had felt when he promised to return. Those memories felt distant now, fading with every breath she took under this canvas sky. Wanted to hate the man before her, to resist the pull of something she didn't understand. But the truth was, she had no strength left to fight. Her body ached, her spirit was tired, and in the deep of her soul, she knew she needed help. She watched him, uncertain, and whispered faintly, "Why are you helping me?" Her voice trembled, more from emotion than pain. The chief looked at her for a long time before answering. His words came slow, each one weighted with meaning. "Because no one helped my wife," he said. "She was taken, she was hurt, and I could not save her." His voice broke slightly, a rare crack in the armor of a man who had carried too many ghosts. The woman felt her chest tighten. The anger she had carried toward him melted into silence. In that stillness, two broken lives stood facing one another, not enemies, but survivors of different wars. He reached behind him and picked up a small pouch made of deerskin. From it, he took a mixture of herbs and began to crush them between his fingers. The smell filled the air, strong, bitter, healing. "These will stop the pain," he said, "but you must be still." She nodded faintly, watching him work, feeling the heat from the fire blend with the warmth of his touch as he placed the herbs on her wound. Her body tensed at first, but then the pain began to ease. She could feel his breath near her face, steady and calm, grounding her to the moment. The outside world seemed to vanish, the fear, the loss, the chaos, and all that remained was the rhythm of the fire and the sound of his quiet voice. Hours passed, though neither could tell how many. The flames burned low, and the night grew colder. The woman finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "What will happen to me?" she asked. The chief's eyes lifted to hers, and in them she saw something unexpected and certainty. For a man who had led warriors into countless battles, it was rare to see hesitation. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the fire, then back at her. "The white men will come," he said finally. "They always come. But you are not like them. You have eyes that see." His hand brushed against her hair, a gesture so gentle it startled her. "You were sent here for a reason." She wanted to ask what reason he meant, but her lips refused to move. Her body was weak, and her mind was lost in a haze between pain and peace. The chief stayed beside her, keeping the fire alive, watching over her as if guarding something sacred. Every so often, he would glance at her face, as if afraid she might disappear like smoke in the morning light. He didn't understand what was happening inside him. He had sworn to live for revenge, to never let his heart feel again. But here, in this small circle of warmth and silence, he felt something stir, a feeling he had buried long ago. As dawn began to break beyond the horizon, the fire's glow softened. The woman stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. She saw him there, still watching, still protecting. For a moment she felt safe. But the silence between them carried something heavier now, an unspoken truth that neither dared to name. The Apache chief leaned forward, his hand resting over hers, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rest now," he said. "The sun will rise soon." The woman's breath trembled as she looked into his eyes, realizing that her life was no longer her own. She didn't know if she was his prisoner or his salvation, and he didn't know whether she was a curse or a chance at redemption. The night that had begun in fear had turned into something neither of them could control. Outside, the first light touched the desert, and somewhere beyond the camp, the sound of horses echoed faintly distant, but coming closer. The woman's eyes widened, her heart pounding again as she turned toward the sound. The chief stood, his hand reaching for his weapon, his expression hardening once more. The world outside was ready to shatter whatever fragile peace had formed between them. And as he looked back at her one last time before stepping into the morning, she knew this was only the beginning. The morning sun broke over the distant hills, painting the desert in soft gold and red. Smoke from dying campfires curled lazily into the sky as the Apache camp stirred to life. The woman lay still on the fur blanket, the warmth of the fire fading, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. Her mind was foggy, heavy with exhaustion, but her heart pounded as she remembered the sound of horses at dawn and the chief's sudden silence before he stepped outside. She could still feel the heat of his touch, the way his voice had softened when he told her to rest. Yet now, that comfort was replaced by uncertainty. She turned her head toward the tent opening where shadows moved beyond the flap. Voices murmured low and quick, the deep tones of Apache warriors mixed with the sharp cry of a bird overhead. She caught only fragments of their speech, not enough to understand, but enough to sense something serious. When the chief returned, his expression was unreadable, his eyes darker than before. His broad shoulders carried the weight of command, and though his presence filled the tent, his silence said more than words could. He crouched beside her, his hand brushing the edge of the fur. "You must stay inside," he said quietly. "There are riders near the river, white men, man soldiers maybe." His voice was steady, but the tension beneath it was clear. The woman's pulse quickened. "They're looking for me," she whispered. The chief nodded slightly, his gaze flicking to the tent opening as if already calculating what would happen next. Maybe they hunt my people again." The woman tried to sit up, wincing as a dull pain shot through her side. He reached out quickly, steadying her with one strong hand. For a moment their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared fear, but also something more fragile, something neither could name. She wanted to ask him why he was protecting her at all. It would have been easier for him to hand her over, to rid himself of a burden. But instead, he was risking everything. Outside, the camp grew louder. Horses neighed, children called to one another, and the smell of wood smoke thickened. The woman's stomach tightened with hunger, but she dared not ask for food. Instead, she watched him prepare for whatever was coming. He took up his bow and quiver, moving with quiet precision, his every motion practiced and sure. His bare back glistened with morning light, the scars across his skin telling stories of battles fought long before she ever arrived. When he stepped outside again, she could hear him speaking to the others. His tone was calm, but there was command in every syllable. The camp obeyed him without question. He was not just a leader by title, he was the spirit that held these people together. The woman wondered how a man who ruled with such strength could also show such tenderness in private. Time moved slowly as the sun climbed higher. The woman's thoughts wandered to her old life, to the soft linens of her home, the hum of prayer in the small church by the river. Her father had warned her not to travel through Apache land. Her husband had promised to protect her. But now both were gone, and she was caught in a world that saw her as neither friend nor enemy, only as something between. The tent flap rustled again, and a young Apache girl entered, no older than 12, carrying a clay bowl filled with warm broth. The girl's dark eyes met hers shyly before she set the bowl down and whispered something the woman couldn't understand. Still, there was kindness in the gesture. The woman smiled faintly and nodded in thanks. The girl smiled back and slipped away, her braids swinging behind her as she disappeared into the sunlight. She lifted the bowl carefully, the aroma earthy and strange but comforting. Each sip seemed to bring her back to herself. Still, the unease would not leave. She kept hearing the echo of the chief's words. Soldiers, maybe. That meant the outside world was closer than she thought. When the chief returned again near midday, his face was hard, his jaw set. "They are at the river," he said. "5 riders. They search, but not yet here." He sat beside her, resting his weapons against the wall. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she set the bowl aside. "If they find your camp, they'll kill you," she said. He met her gaze steadily. "They always try." His calmness unnerved her. "Then why not let me go?" "I could tell them you spared me." His eyes darkened, not in anger, but in thought. "If I let you go," he said, "they follow you. They come here again. They bring more guns. They kill my people." He paused, his voice lowering. "If you stay, maybe they stop looking." The woman's throat tightened. "You want to use me?" He shook his head slowly. "No, I want to protect what I can." There was no answer she could give to that. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, neither of them fully understood. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire. She looked at him then, not as a captive would look at her captor, but as one human seeing another, stripped of everything but truth. He was not the monster she had imagined from the tales told in town. He was something far more complicated, a man bound by pain and duty, shaped by loss, and still capable of mercy. The afternoon brought heat and stillness. The wind died, and the air shimmered outside the tent. The chief had gone again, leaving 2 guards nearby. The woman could hear them speaking softly, their words like music she could not translate. She wanted to step outside to feel the sun, but she dared not. Instead, she lay back, staring up at the curved ceiling of the tent, wondering what her life had become. She thought of her mother's hands, the way they would brush her hair behind her ear when she was a child. She thought of the promise she had made before her husband left for war, to stay alive no matter what. She had kept that promise, though she didn't know why anymore. The world she once knew had fallen away. Late in the day, the chief returned once more, dust on his boots, his expression sharper than before. "They have set camp," he said, "by the river. They will come tomorrow." The woman's heart pounded. "What will you do?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. No. He sat across from her, staring into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. I do not know yet, he said finally. Bet, but I will not let them take you. She wanted to believe him, but fear gnawed at her. They will kill you, she said again, her voice trembling. He smiled faintly, a tired smile that carried no fear. Then I die as a warrior, not as a ghost. As the sky turned crimson outside, the camp grew quiet again. The woman felt the weight of night pressing in. She could hear the chief outside, speaking with his men, giving orders in a voice low and sure. Somewhere far off, thunder rumbled. A storm was coming, whether from the sky or from men on horseback. She couldn't tell. When he returned, he carried a blanket made of soft deerskin and laid it gently over her. You should rest, he said. Tomorrow will be long. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for answers. Why do you care? She asked softly. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, Because I have seen enough death. He turned toward the fire, his profile outlined by the orange glow. His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. My people once believed the Great Spirit gave every man to hearts one for war and one for love. If a man forgets one, the other dies too. He looked at her then, and for a moment the air between them felt charged, heavy with something that neither dared name. The woman's breath trembled. And which heart lives in you now? She asked. He hesitated, then answered quietly, That depends on what happens at dawn. The night stretched long and sleepless. Rain began to fall outside, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the tent. The woman closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound of thunder and her own racing thoughts. She could sense movement beyond the camp, shadows shifting in the dark. The horses snorted, restless, and the guards murmured to one another. In the dim glow of the dying fire, the chief sat watching her, his bow across his knees. His gaze fixed on the tent opening. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. He knew that tomorrow might bring blood, yet as he watched the woman sleep, something in him stirred a faint flicker of something he thought long dead. Outside, lightning flashed across the sky, lighting the desert in a burst of white. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then the thunder came, rolling deep and low like the growl of the earth itself. The storm had begun, and with it, the beginning of something that neither the Apache chief nor the woman could control. The night held its breath, waiting for the dawn that would decide their fate. Rain poured over the Apache camp through the night, drumming against the hides of the tents, soaking the earth until the air smelled of wet clay and smoke. The woman woke to the sound of distant thunder rolling across the canyon and the faint cry of an eagle above the storm. She turned her head toward the dying fire, where the Apache chief still sat, his posture unbroken, his eyes fixed on the tent opening. He had not slept at all. His face looked carved from stone, calm yet weary, his mind somewhere far beyond the rain. She wanted to speak to him, but something in his stillness told her to stay quiet. Outside, the camp was restless. The storm had brought cold and unease, and every warrior knew what waited beyond the hills. Soldiers, the woman could feel it. Too, the air itself seemed to hum with coming violence. She closed her eyes for a moment, wishing she could forget the life she'd lived before this one. But memories clung to her like the scent of smoke. She saw her father's farm again, the wide fields, the soft laughter of her husband before the war took him away. That world was gone now, and no amount of wishing could bring it back. When dawn came, the storm began to fade. Mist hung over the valley, and the camp was quiet except for the soft snort of horses. The chief rose, his movements slow but purposeful. He stepped outside, his shoulders tense beneath the weight of the morning. The woman followed him with her eyes until he disappeared into the pale light. She could hear voices, then men speaking quickly, their tones urgent. One voice rose above the rest, sharp and angry, and though she couldn't understand the words, she could feel the argument burning between them. Moments later, the chief returned, his jaw set. His men looked at him with mixed expressions, some with loyalty, others with doubt. When he entered the tent, the air seemed to change. They want to send you away, he said quietly. They fear the soldiers will come for you, and they do not want war again. She looked up at him, her pulse racing. And what do you want? She asked. His gaze met hers, steady and dark. If they find you on the open ground, you will die, he said. If you stay, they may all die. I do not know which choice is right anymore. The weight of his words hung heavy between them. She realized then that this man feared across the borderlands, carried burdens no one saw. He wasn't only fighting soldiers, he was fighting the ghosts of every life taken, every fire burned into memory. She wanted to speak comfort, but she couldn't find the words. The space between them was filled with silence that said more than speech ever could. Outside, a group of warriors gathered near the river's edge. Among them was a younger man with a restless fire in his eyes, the chief's second. Known among the camp for his skill with the rifle and his temper that burned as fiercely as the desert sun, he had never trusted the woman. To him, she was a danger, a curse brought into their midst. He had lost his brother in a raid led by white soldiers, and he could not separate her face from their memory. He spoke to the others now, his voice sharp and rising, his words carried by the wind. Some nodded in agreement. The woman could see their faces through the tent opening, the anger building, the division spreading like cracks in dry earth. The chief stepped out to face them. His voice was low but firm, commanding respect even as it met resistance. The younger man shouted back, his hand gripping his rifle, his words biting with fury. The argument grew louder, and the camp watched in tense silence. For a moment it seemed violence would erupt among them. Then the chief raised his hand and all fell quiet. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the air. "This woman is under my protection, okay? Any man who breaks that law will answer to me." His words struck like thunder, and no one dared to move. The younger man glared at him, his eyes burning with resentment. "You risk all of us for her," he said. "You have forgotten who you are." The chief's gaze hardened. "Remember well who I am," he replied. "Do you?" That question ended the argument, but not the tension. The camp scattered in silence, each man returning to his tent with thoughts heavy as the rain-soaked ground. The woman saw the fire in their eyes and knew she was the reason for it. She felt guilt twist in her chest, yet she also felt something else, a growing sense of connection to the man who had chosen to stand between her and death itself. Later that day, the chief took her to the edge of the camp. The rain had stopped, and the land was quiet, the sky painted in faint gray. From the hill, she could see the river below, winding through the valley like a silver thread. Beyond it, smoke rose from a distant fire. "Soldiers, they have set camp there," he said. "They wait for the storm to pass before they move." His tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed worry. "Will they come here?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. "They always come." She stood beside him, shivering in the cool wind. "If they attack, what will you do?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the land, his gaze distant. "A warrior fights to protect what the world tries to destroy," he said. "Sometimes that means his people. Sometimes it means something else." That night, the camp grew tense. The younger warrior gathered a small group by the fire, whispering plans of leaving, of taking the woman and delivering her to the soldiers in exchange for peace. He believed it was the only way to save their tribe from another massacre, but loyalty held the others back. The chief's word was law, even when it went against their fear. Still, the whispers grew, feeding the air with doubt. The woman could sense it. Every time she stepped outside the tent, eyes followed her. Some were filled with curiosity, others with hatred. Children hid behind their mothers when she passed. She felt like a ghost wandering among strangers. Only the young girl who had brought her food before would smile when she saw her. The girl would come often, bringing bits of bread or dried berries, her laughter a small light in the heavy air. That evening, as the sun set behind the cliffs, the chief sat beside the fire, sharpening his knife. The orange glow reflected in his eyes as he worked silently. "Act." The woman approached, her steps uncertain. "You can still let me go," she said quietly. "They would follow me, not you." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "You do not understand," he said. "They would kill you before you reached the river. And even if they didn't, they would return for blood anyway. You are not their goal. I am." The truth in his words struck her harder than she expected. She sat beside him, the fire's warmth brushing her face. "Why are they after you?" she asked. He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Years ago, I led a raid against a fort near the border. They called it revenge, but it was justice for what they did to my people. They burned our homes, took our women, killed the children who could not run. I fought back. And ever since, they have hunted me like a wolf." She looked at him then with new eyes, not as a savage or a captor, but as a man who had lost everything and kept fighting anyway. "You've carried that pain a long time," she whispered. His hand paused over the blade. "Pain is what keeps a man breathing when hope is gone," he said. The night grew colder, and the sound of the river echoed through the valley. The woman stared into the fire, her thoughts tangled between fear and something deeper she didn't dare name. Every moment she spent near him, the world she had known slipped further away. Then, from the darkness beyond the camp, came a distant sound, the faint crack of a rifle. The chief froze, his head snapping up, his hand going to his weapon. Another shot followed, closer this time. The camp erupted in shouts. Warriors ran toward the river, grabbing their weapons, calling to one another. The woman's heart pounded as she rose to her feet. The chief turned to her sharply. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice firm. But she didn't sit. She followed him to the tent's entrance and peered out. The night was alive with chaos. Torches flickered, horses neighed, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the canyon walls. The younger warrior was shouting orders, rallying men to defend the camp. The chief ran toward the noise, disappearing into the shadows of trees and rain. She clutched the tent flap, her breath trembling. The firelight flickered across her face as the sounds of battle grew louder. Somewhere in the darkness, she thought she heard his voice calling out in a language she could not understand. Then came silence, a long, heavy silence that pressed on her chest like a weight. The wind rose, carrying the smell of smoke and gunpowder. She stepped back, her heart racing, her mind torn between fear for herself and fear for him. Somewhere beyond the river, the soldiers were moving, and the line between protection and destruction was about to blur forever. The night stretched wide, holding its breath once again, waiting to see who would survive when the dawn finally came. The night swallowed the valley in smoke and thunder. Gunfire echoed through the canyon, flashes of light tearing through the rain-soaked dark. The woman stood at the tent's entrance, trembling as the world outside seemed to break apart. She could hear men shouting in Apache and the sharp crack of rifles carried by the wind. Every sound felt closer than the last. Somewhere in that chaos was the chief, the man who had promised to protect her even when his people doubted him. She pressed her hands against her chest, praying silently, her heart beating faster with every scream that rose from the shadows. The young girl who often brought her food ran past the tent, crying out for her mother. The woman caught her arm, pulling her inside. The girl's face was streaked with dirt and fear. "The soldiers," she gasped. "They are at the river. The men fight them, but more are coming." The woman's stomach turned cold. She looked toward the dim glow of the fire outside and felt an ache deep in her chest. "Stay here," she told the girl. "Don't go anywhere." But even as she spoke, she knew she couldn't just stay hidden while the battle raged around them. She grabbed the fur cloak from the ground and stepped out into the storm. The air was thick with gunpowder and rain, the sound of horses clashing with the cries of the wounded. Flames licked at the edges of the camp as arrows set the outer tents ablaze. Through the smoke, she saw the younger warrior, the one who had argued with the chief, leading a small group toward the river. His eyes caught hers for a moment, burning with resentment and something like accusation. She turned away knowing what he must think, that she had brought this destruction with her. She stumbled forward, her feet sinking into the mud, her eyes searching the shadows for the chief. The sky flashed white with lightning, and for a brief instant she saw him standing near the edge of the trees, bow drawn, firing into the darkness where the soldiers advanced. His stance was strong, steady, unyielding. He moved with the calm of a man who had faced death too many times to fear it. But even from a distance, she could see the weight in his movements. He was fighting for more than his people. He was fighting against the ghosts of every loss he'd endured. A bullet tore through the air, striking the ground near her feet. She gasped and dropped to her knees, mud splashing her hands. The sound jolted the chief, and he turned sharply, his eyes locking on her. In that flash of lightning, she saw his expression, shock, fear, and something deeper, something protective. He shouted something she couldn't understand, but his meaning was clear: "Get back." Before she could move, a figure emerged from the smoke behind her, a soldier, his face pale under the flickering firelight. He raised his rifle, his hand trembling, his eyes fixed on her as if unsure whether she was a threat or a victim. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Then in a blur, The chief was there, lunged between them, tackling the soldier to the ground. The rifle fired, the shot tearing through the night, and both men rolled through the mud. The woman screamed his name, but her voice was lost in the chaos. More soldiers were coming now, their boots pounding against the wet earth. The younger Apache warrior shouted orders, rallying his men toward the river. But the soldiers' fire was relentless. Bullets tore through the air, striking tents, horses, and men alike. The camp that had once been alive with laughter and warmth now burned under the weight of war. The woman ran forward, her hands trembling, her eyes locked on the chief as he fought to his feet. He turned toward her, his shoulder bleeding from a fresh wound. "Go back," he shouted, his voice raw with command, but she couldn't move. Every instinct in her told her to stay, to fight beside him even though she had no weapon, no strength to stand against the storm that had come for them. The rain fell harder, turning the earth into a river of mud. The sound of the river itself grew louder, swollen by the storm. The woman saw the younger warrior again, firing his rifle into the darkness, but his expression had changed. He wasn't just fighting soldiers, now he was fighting his own doubt. He glanced toward the chief and the woman, something in his face shifting as realization struck him that their fate was tied to his own. Then, from beyond the river, came the sound of a bugleless signal that froze the air. The chief's eyes narrowed. More soldiers were coming. He looked toward his men, then back at the woman, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. She saw everything in that glance, the unspoken promise, the burden of leadership, the love he dared not speak aloud. A cannon blast shattered the silence, sending a burst of dirt and flame into the air. The force knocked her backward, the world spinning. She hit the ground hard, the breath torn from her lungs. The chief rushed to her side, pulling her up, his hand steady on her arm. "You must go," he said, his voice low but urgent. "There is a path behind the rocks. Follow it. Do not look back." She shook her head, tears mixing with the rain. "I won't leave you." His jaw tightened. "You have to." He reached out, his hand brushing her face, his thumb wiping the mud from her cheek. "You carry life," he whispered, his gaze flicking to her stomach. "If you die, everything dies with you." The truth struck her harder than the storm itself. She hadn't spoken of it aloud since the night he found her. The child she carried was the last piece of the world she had lost, the reason he had sworn to protect her. But before she could answer, another explosion shook the ground. The younger warrior ran toward them, shouting over the roar of the rain. "They've crossed the river," he yelled. "We can't hold them." The chief looked to him, his expression unreadable. "Take the others," he ordered. "Lead them to the caves. Protect the children." The younger man hesitated, torn between anger and loyalty. "What about you?" he asked. "I will stay," the chief said. "Go." For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, warrior to warrior, leader to brother. Then the younger man nodded and ran off into the smoke, gathering what was left of the tribe. The chief turned back to her, his face illuminated by the flicker of flames. "When the time comes," he said, "you will know what to do." He handed her a small pouch, the same one he had used to heal her wounds before. Inside was a mixture of herbs, a token of protection. "Take this," he said softly. "It is all I can give you." She took it, her fingers trembling as their hands brushed. The touch lingered for a moment longer than it should have, filled with everything they could not say. Then he turned and disappeared into the storm. She watched him go, her body shaking with fear and cold. The rain blurred her vision, but she could still see his silhouette against the firelight strong. Unyielding, a man standing between two worlds. Around her, the camp fell apart, the cries of battle mixing with the rumble of thunder. The woman clutched the pouch to her chest and stumbled toward the path he had told her about, the rocks looming like dark sentinels in the night. Behind her, the sounds of war grew louder. She looked back once and saw the flames rise higher, the shadows of men locked in struggle. The chief was somewhere among them, his bow raised, his spirit burning like the fire that consumed the world around him. She wanted to run to him, to stop him, to scream his name into the storm, but she couldn't. The ground shook, and the sky split open with lightning. She turned and fled toward the canyon, her heart breaking with every step. As she reached the edge of the rocks, she heard his voice in the distance, shouting orders, defying death itself. And then came a sound that silenced everything: the deep. rolling boom of a cannon firing too close, followed by the earth itself giving way. The air filled with dust and fire, and the woman fell to her knees, her body shaking, her tears lost in the rain. The world around her was collapsing, the camp burning behind her, the river roaring in rage. She could not see him anymore. All she could do was listen to the cries of battle fading into the storm, to the sound of her own heartbeat pounding like a drum of survival. She pressed her hand to her stomach and whispered a prayer, not knowing if anyone would hear it. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of smoke, blood, and memory. The night refused to end, and as the woman crouched beneath the rocks, she knew the moment of truth was coming. The line between life and death had never been thinner, and somewhere in the heart of that fire, the Apache chief still fought not just for his people, but for the fragile promise that connected them both. The first light of morning crept over the canyon, weak and gray after the storm. Smoke hung in the air like a curtain, heavy and bitter. The woman opened her eyes slowly, her body aching, her hair damp and tangled against her face. The world was silent now, too silent. She sat up, her hands pressing against the cold ground, and looked toward where the camp had once been. What she saw broke something inside her. The fire had burned out, leaving only the blackened remains of tents and the twisted shapes of what was left behind. The land that had once been alive with voices and laughter was now a graveyard washed clean by rain. Her heart pounded as she rose to her feet, her legs trembling. She began to walk, each step heavier than the last. The air smelled of ashes and wet earth. She called out softly at first, then louder, her voice echoing off the cliffs. "Where are you?" she cried. "Please answer me." There was no reply, only the faint whisper of the wind moving through the broken trees. She moved through the camp, stepping over fallen arrows and charred wood. Here and there she found signs of life tracks leading toward the hills. A child's toy half buried in the mud, a horse grazing nervously near the edge of the river. The younger warrior's rifle lay beside a rock, empty and cold. She knew he must have led the survivors away as the chief had ordered. That gave her hope, but it wasn't enough. She needed to find him. Her eyes searched the ground for any trace of him. The river had swollen from the storm, carrying away much of the battlefield. She followed the sound of the water, her steps quick and unsteady, her breath short with dread. Then, near the bend of the river, she saw something that made her stop. A bow, carved from dark wood, lay half buried in the mud. The design on it, the mark of a wolf's head burned into the grip, was his. Her hands shook as she picked it up. The weight of it felt familiar, alive with memory. She looked downstream where the current rushed over rocks and debris, and for a moment she thought she saw him, his figure among the shadows, standing tall as he always did. But when she blinked, he was gone. Only the wind remained. She sank to her knees, clutching the bow against her chest, the tears coming harder now. All the fear, all the pain that had built inside her through the long nights finally broke free. "You promised," she whispered through the sobs. "You said I would know what to do." The river answered in silence. Hours passed before she moved again. The sun had risen higher, burning through the mist. She wiped her face and stood, looking toward the canyon walls. Somewhere beyond them, she knew the rest of his people had gone. She could not stay here. She turned and began to climb the rocky slope, each step a battle between exhaustion and will. The land stretched wide and endless before her, but she didn't feel alone. Something in the air told her he was still with her, not in body, but in spirit, guiding her forward. By midday, she found the others. The younger warrior saw her first, his expression frozen between shock and disbelief. He ran to her, his eyes scanning the path behind her. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice raw. She shook her head slowly, unable to speak. His face fell, the strength leaving him. He turned away, his jaw tight as he tried to hide the emotion that welled behind his eyes. "He stayed," he said softly. "He always said he would." The camp they had built was small and quiet, hidden among the rocks. The children huddled close to their mothers, their faces pale and tired. The woman moved among them, offering what comfort she could. The young girl who had once brought her food ran to her, throwing her arms around her waist. "You came back," the girl whispered. The woman held her close, tears returning to her eyes. I promised I would. That night the fire burned low, its glow soft and warm against the dark. The younger warrior sat apart, his rifle across his knees. The woman approached him quietly, holding the chief's bow in her hands. "He would want you to have it," she said. The young man looked up, his eyes glistening in the firelight. For a moment, pride and grief mixed across his face. He took the bow gently, his fingers tracing the mark of the wolf. "He was my brother," he said. "Not by blood, but by the bond of battle. Saved us all." The woman nodded, her voice trembling. "Saved me too." They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind move through the canyons. The stars shone clearer than they had in many nights, bright and endless over the desert sky. She looked up at them and thought of his words about the Great Spirit giving every man 2 hearts. She understood now. He had found his second heart before the end. Days turned into weeks. The tribe moved north to safer land, away from the burned valley and the soldiers who had destroyed it. The woman traveled with them, helping tend the wounded and the children. In time, the soldiers stopped hunting. The war quieted, as wars always do after they have taken enough. Life began to grow again, fragile but determined. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills, she stood by the river once more. The air was warm, the water calm. She could still see the reflection of the flames in her memory, but they no longer brought fear. Instead, they carried a strange peace. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small deerskin pouch he had given her. Inside, the herbs had long dried, but their scent still held faint traces of smoke and life. She opened it and let the wind carry the leaves into the river. "You kept your promise," she whispered. As the current carried them away, she felt a warmth in her chest, like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. She pressed her hand over her stomach, where life still stirred quietly within her. She smiled then, small and tired, but real. He had been right. She didn't know what to do. When the baby was born months later, the tribe celebrated quietly under the stars. The child's eyes were dark like his, calm and steady, even in their first moments. The younger warrior stood beside her, his expression softening as he looked at the child. "He will carry his spirit," he said, "and his name." The woman nodded, whispering the word the chief had once told her meant light after storm. That was what she would call him. Years passed. The child grew strong, running through the canyons with the other children, learning the ways of the Apache and the songs of the river. The woman watched him from a distance sometimes, her heart filled with pride and sorrow woven together. The land had changed, but it still remembered. Each time the wind swept through the valley, it carried the echo of the chief's voice, his promise, and the fire that once burned in his heart. In the quiet moments of night, when the stars were bright and the desert was still, she would sit by the fire and tell the story of the man who had saved her not just from death, but from despair. The man who had shown her that even in a world full of war and loss, love could still bloom like a wildflower in the dust. The others would listen, and though some would weep and others would smile, all would remember him, the wolf of the Red Mesa, the chief who fought with both hearts until the very end. And when the wind rose again, sweeping through the canyon, she would close her eyes and whisper to the darkness, "You are still here." The flames would flicker, the stars would shine, and somewhere far beyond the horizon, the spirit of the Apache chief would ride with the dawn free, eternal, and unforgotten.